Well, just remember, without darkness, there can be no light. Oh, that's a good dark roast. Hello minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Glad you could join me today. Today I'm doing something pretty special. I am part of a 7 YouTube channel collaboration. Group of arts and crafts people, we decided to get together and collab on a subject, and that subject is entitled
The Biggest Art Mistake.
You can follow the biggest art mistake hashtag if you want to. It's down in the description. Hopefully it'll pop up on places like Instagram and Facebook also. You can use that hashtag if you want to chime in. And we all kind of come at it from our experience of what we see on a day-to-day basis over our years of experience. In this case, mistakes that keep happening again, that hold beginners back, or maybe not even beginners. Could be anybody, but mistakes that we see repeated often. So in this collaboration, we thought we would share that knowledge and experience with you. So here's a quick list of the other 6 channels. I hope you'll go check them out. I will link to them below in the description. Go find out what, through their experience, has been one of the biggest mistakes that they see. All right, so what about watercolor? Oh, you don't make any mistakes? Really? I see the same mistakes crop up time and again. And there are lots of mistakes, but this one I see all the time. I mean, it is the most prevalent. And that is
Weak contrast.
Let's go right to the board and I will show you what I'm talking about. Alright, so this is a handout I did recently for a local class I'm teaching. And every watercolor painting, there is a range of values. Duh, I know, right? But you need to think about what that range is and how to get those on your paper. And a lot of times you can do that before you even paint. So if you see these trees here and this is the sort of value range you're looking at. The lightest values, and in some cases even lighter, and the darkest values. You need to be able to replicate those and use those. One of the things I always recommend to beginning watercolor painters is to work on a value scale. When you work on a value scale, it is all about one thing, and that is the ratio of water in your brush and pigment in that water. Now I've done a whole video on this, so I'm not going to go into in detail how to do that. This is the first step to getting a lot of contrast in your painting, is making sure that you can accomplish the full range on demand. You can make the lightest value when you want to, and you can make the deepest value when you want to. But start with the lightest value and just work your way down. Any of you out there are musicians, this is like playing and learning your scales. Now you don't have to do a full 10-step scale. You can do 3 or 4 values. Usually there's a light value, a middle, a couple middle, like a light middle, dark middle value, and your deepest values. A lot of beginner values that I see are right here in this range. I'm going to butt these 2 pieces up together. So more typically, this is the value range that I see rather than this. Water to pigment ratio just takes practice. Try producing a value scale. I recommend, if you're a beginner, add a few more steps, like 4 or 5 steps to that value scale. And maybe even go down and just create a whisper of color. You want to be able to create every value. Try mixing a color and painting in a color that's almost black. Because someplace, you're probably going to use something that's very close to black or very, very dark. So that's the first tip. Just make sure you can recreate those values. But here's a couple other things to look for. Bleeding, and this is a problem I see a lot. They'll want to charge in shadows. So let's say we're doing a simple tree. Now when I'm doing a wet and wet charge for a tree, the first wash I put down will usually be the lightest value, okay? So a lot of times what I'll see is charging in and then adding too much water. And it starts out looking good, like there's some contrast, but as it spreads, that value takes over the whole shape. And before you know it, and I'm going to exaggerate the effect, before you know it, you just have one solid shape with no contrast and slightly darker value. The way to charge in is to make sure that this shape has soaked into the paper a little bit. You still want a good bit of sheen and wetness on the paper, but you don't want a lot. Now I'm going to get a dark color that is mostly pigment, and I'm going to charge in. Now this is soaked into the paper enough that it's not, the washes are not moving as much as they did. Sometimes you can come back even, as long as that's wet and still moving the pigment. Just tap in with some really concentrated pigment. You don't want a lot of water in your brush. I think a lot of flat values in watercolor are really due to this problem, not managing and controlling your water and your pigment ratio. And that just takes time and practice. Now another thing, I was actually talking to a watercolor painter the other day, a beginner, and this person mentioned that they were just under the impression that when you paint in watercolor, you got to do it all on one layer. So that's my next tip. If you're having trouble with charging, then just try layering. Don't forget your glazing. Glazing, which is just putting one transparent layer over another after the first layer is dry. Glazing is a great way to continue to deepen your value. So this is dry. This might be layer 1. I'll go in with a wet, sort of flat color layer on top of this. So this is sort of my middle value. You can do this in as many layers as you want. You just want to make sure to leave your highlights. So there's layer 2. So that's dry. Let's go in for a layer 3. Deeper values, taking up less area, just sort of at the base of those. In the case of a tree, you can blend some of those out if you want. But this is really not about blending technique or even how to paint a tree. This is about building up your values. And even here where I did this with the charge in, notice the drying shift. And this is another tip, is a lot of beginners don't take into account the drying shift, or they don't know about it. Sometimes you have to make your colors darker. Even on this where I charged in the deeper values, I'm going to go back and I'm going to add a glaze for some of the darker ones. And in transparent watercolor, your additional glazes just combine and make the values that were underneath them darker. So it's a buildup. You don't have to make it dark as it needs to be all in one whack. And look for ways to add contrast to your painting. Nice strategic areas where they'll really make the painting pop. It could be a shape behind another shape that just looks like it would help bring some drama to the scene if you made it nice and deep. Now I know I'm talking mainly about landscape, but in every kind of image, you have opportunities usually to add some nice pops of contrast. And finally, my last tip, just make sure you're seeing values correctly. Get good reference and study the values in it. Rehearse to yourself where the darkest areas are. Try to match those up to your value scale. And where the lightest values are, try to match those up to your value scale. Try to recreate those separately before you start painting if you want to, so you know ahead of time what amount of paint and water it takes to achieve those values. I hope those tips help. I hope you enjoyed The Biggest Mistake, and I hope you'll go see the other channels, find out what they have found in their experience to be the biggest mistake. Go out and paint something and get some value punch in those paintings. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you tuning in. Thank you so much, patrons, for sponsoring this video, and we will see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.